Hello, global gardeners, and happy Monday, or possibly happy Tuesday. I always talk about how we are a global audience. We've got Eli from In the Garden with Eli and Kate in Scotland, and we have Earthly Spaces from the Netherlands. And Rick is checking in from Australia, where it's already tomorrow after midnight. And so I was thinking about this when I saw that Rick had checked in before the show started. And I'm not aware of another YouTube live stream that actually takes place on 2 days at the same time. And so as far as gardening live streams go, we are covering not only all sides of the planet, but all times of the day as well. So thanks for being up so early in the morning to join us, Rick. We'll try to make it worthwhile for you today, as for everybody else as well. So we'll be talking gardening. I'll be answering your gardening questions. And of course, today I want the focus to be on greenhouses, because this is something, for me at least, is really making a difference in my garden right now. I've said before that it took me 20 years to reach the point where I had budgeted and planned and was finally to the point that I could put a greenhouse in my garden. And this is a picture of the greenhouse behind me today, this morning, that I just took. And I always wanted a greenhouse. I know many gardeners do, but you really can't fully describe how wonderful it is to have a greenhouse and to have all the plants that are growing so well in the greenhouse until you have such a terrible year like we're having here in Colorado with the rain and the cold, and the rest of my garden is either not planted or is doing very poorly, or is probably going to live fallow for the rest of the season because it's getting too late to put plants in the ground. But here in my greenhouse, things are working great. I've got, you can see in this lower corner, that's some tomato plants that I have growing. Those tomato plants are already about 5 feet tall. I'm getting tomatoes on them. I have my super hot peppers that are rolling through that haven't started flowering yet, but they're all growing great. I've got a couple fig trees that survived the winter, and the fig trees are doing great. And I've got all of my tomato plants and some basil plants that are waiting to go outside because it's just been so cold and wet here in Colorado. If I didn't have my greenhouse, my season would be almost completely over. I've put some seeds in the ground and they didn't germinate and rotted because of these crazy conditions. So having a greenhouse has really given me that good warm gardener feeling that I always like to have. So as I started thinking about it, I thought, well, let's talk about greenhouses for others who might be thinking about getting a greenhouse, or who have a greenhouse and maybe it's not as productive as they hoped it would be. And so let's talk about that today. And it's great that Eli is on, because In the Garden with Eli and Kate YouTube channel has got some great videos on growing in a greenhouse. And so I'm sure she can field some questions that might come up about it. It's one of those things that it's easy once you figure it out, but you got to figure it out. You'll probably have a lot of problems the first few times that you do the greenhouse growing. And Shandy's Garden is saying, I'm definitely going to put thermal heating flooring in my greenhouse and barrels in there whenever I get it up and it actually works. Maybe this greenhouse won't be trash. Hope third time's a charm. And that's a good point, because I've said this in video, one of my greenhouse videos, I think, where a gardener gets a greenhouse, they think it's going to be great, but they don't necessarily take the time to figure it out, and then the weather is weird, and all of a sudden the greenhouse isn't the magic solution that a lot of gardeners think it will be, and it ends up being a storage shed. I can't tell you how many gardeners I know that use their greenhouse as a storage shed. My buddy Larry has a greenhouse a little bit smaller than mine, And he only grows in one small section on a table and on the floor on the one wall that faces towards the sun. And the rest of it is for pots and soil and storage and lots of other considerations, because it can be difficult to grow, especially like in a region like mine. My biggest concern growing in a greenhouse is it just gets so hot during the summer. It's not unusual for me to have a couple weeks where it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 32 degrees Celsius. And a greenhouse, at least the ones that I've grown in, is typically at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air, because it's collecting all that heat and it's holding all that heat in, and you have to be careful about it getting too hot. Well, days like I've been having where it's been nice and cool, the greenhouse is actually ideal growing conditions for the plants that I'm going to grow. And so, as Shandy's Garden points out, third time's a charm, so I'm guessing that they've already tried it a couple times. When you figure out how to heat and cool your greenhouse so that it is an effective growing environment, then it becomes one of those things that really is good. Now, I've got these blue barrels, and you can see some of the black jugs of water that I have on the north side of my greenhouse. That's the side away from the sun. I'm up to about 240 gallons of water, and I've noticed a substantial difference in the moderation of the temperature. That water absorbs the heat during the day and releases that heat at night. And so every morning I'm waking up and checking the temperature, and my greenhouse is staying about 12 degrees warmer overnight than it used to before I put all that water in. And so that 12 degrees is about 7.5 degrees Celsius warmer just because of the water. And it's an inverse relationship as well. I'm also noticing that my greenhouse is staying cooler when I do get sun, because that water is absorbing some of that heat that would normally be distributed to the soil and the air and the plants. So I'm going to continue to check this over the course of the summer, but trying to avoid those excessive temperatures are really a good idea. And that's one of the reasons why, at least in my region, so many of the greenhouse growers stop growing in a greenhouse. It's just too hot during the summer to grow anything. And so I already have shade cloth that is ready to go. I'll probably hang it in a couple weeks, assuming we get back to normal temperatures. And you can do things like that. Shade cloth during the day will cut down on some of the intensity of the sunlight, so the greenhouse doesn't heat up as much. And then I've got my vents that will be open so that the airflow helps cool it down. The idea being that if you can keep the greenhouse temperature close to the outside air temperature during those hottest months, you have more options of what you can grow. So if it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit outside and I have all my vents open and I have the water that's sucking up the energy, and I've got the shade cloth that's cutting down on the sun's energy reaching that greenhouse, I should be able to keep my inside temperature close to that 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about as hot as you want to get when you're growing your peppers and tomatoes. When it gets above that temperature, you see blossom drop, you see a decrease in pollination. So you really have to work to keep your temperature from getting too high. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about a greenhouse. Start learning about thermodynamics. Start learning about the passive heating systems, or as in the previous discussion, that you have to add heat to the greenhouse because you want to be using it to grow plants in the spring and fall, or even potentially the winter months. So it's more than just putting up a greenhouse and growing plants. You have to create the environment within the greenhouse, and sometimes that takes a lot of work. Hi, Pat. Nice to see you back. Thank you for that contribution. Greenhouses aren't magic, he says. didn't work so well for me. Glad I used cattle panel plastic approach for a lower cost, recycling to create other structures. Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's my whole point. They're not magic. And I think that a lot of gardeners see the big commercial operations and how easy it is to grow plants. Well, if you look closer at those commercial operations, they all have big ventilation systems. They usually have a cooling system in the summer, often that little mist of spray to cool things down. They've got heaters in the winter, and all we see is just the shell of the greenhouse and think it's magic. But as Pat points out, it isn't. It doesn't work well if you for the first time out. And so that's a good suggestion, Pat. Thank you for that. The first time you do a greenhouse, you might consider going with the low cost approach, going with the cattle panel hoops, or going with the metal conduit hoops and covering them with plastic, or you can get specific greenhouse plastics that are a little bit thicker and have UV protection on them. And start that way. Start a greenhouse at a lower cost, so that if it doesn't work out, so that if you have some of those issues and maybe you reconsider whether a greenhouse is really best for you, you haven't invested a lot of money. I was very lucky that the first real greenhouse that I grew in was at the Galileo School, and it had already been constructed by the school district from a grant, from grant money. And so I was able to really learn the ins and outs of greenhouse growing in a greenhouse that I didn't have to put any money into. And so that made it a little bit easier 4 years later, after I left Galileo, to get my own greenhouse, because I had learned some of those lessons the hard way in somebody else's greenhouse. And so if you are thinking about growing or getting a greenhouse of your own, yes, definitely think about starting as inexpensively as possible. But also check out other gardeners that you may know, or seek out gardeners you don't know yet who have a greenhouse and can tell you some of those secrets and what can actually work in your area. And so Jay Dixon is saying, RE cattle panels with a pleading voice. Can someone create a magical way that cattle panels are not 130 Canadian dollars each? Wow. I had no idea they were that expensive up there. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, I made some videos almost 4 years ago now using cattle panels, and at least here where I'm at, they're almost 100% more expensive than they were when I made those videos just 4 years ago. So I can't make a magical way for them to be cheaper, but I will say, relatively speaking, it's a one-time investment, and those cattle panels will last for as long as you garden. So I'm still using the cattle panel trellises that I got, how many years ago was that? 7 or 8 years ago. I'm still using the same cattle panels, and they look the same now as they did then. So think of it as an investment. It is tough. It's hard to fit that into the budget, but that's still a cheaper alternative than investing in a greenhouse kit and then finding out that you don't like growing in a greenhouse, or maybe it's not as easy as you were hoping it would be. Llama Llama says, I need the greenhouse over the next couple of days. It's calling for 36 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. That's about 2 degrees Celsius, and 37 tomorrow. Wow, that's really cold. That's about 3 degrees Celsius. Got my potted plants in there today. Let's hope it doesn't drop any more than that. Yeah, and that's, that ties into what I started with, that I've been using my greenhouse as a warm spot for my plants because it has been getting so cold. We're not getting that cold tonight. It's Thursday. We have a temperature drop. Yesterday was the first day in over 6 weeks that our temperature was normal. It had finally reached the point where it was supposed to be for this time of year. That's how crazy cold it's been for so long. So I'm also very glad I got my greenhouse this year, because it's saving an awful lot of plants from dying moving into the weeks ahead. Keep your fingers crossed about that. Tennessee Nana says, think I'll just stick with winter sowing in jugs. No place to put a greenhouse in my yard unless I remove some of the big, beautiful trees. Not happening. And that's definitely a way to go. Don't feel like you have to get a greenhouse. One of the reasons I wanted to talk today is because I think there is some gardener envy out there where we see people who have a greenhouse and we think we need a greenhouse too. And I want to make it clear that is not the case. You really don't need a greenhouse. And so if you're doing fine growing in jugs and in the beds you have, then keep doing that. But if you do have the space and if you do have that interest, then start thinking about it and do your education ahead of time rather than just assuming that a greenhouse is what you need and then you get it and then you find out it isn't what you want. And that's why I wanted to answer your questions about this and also see what your stories are as far as greenhouses you have had or have been in and wondering if they work best for you. Hi, Eileen, wondering my blueberry plants are 3 years old and have not produced blueberries. The newest leaves are reddish purple. Do my plants need some nutrients? They probably do. And so when your leaves start turning purple, it usually shows that there's a deficiency. It's often a phosphorus deficiency. And as I did in a video last year, I talk about the soil pH. For blueberries, if the soil isn't acidic enough, you're not going to see fruit on them. Now, it's not unusual for fruit trees and fruit bushes to take a few years to fruit. And usually the third year is the time that most of our fruiting plants will give you fruit. But if your leaves are the wrong color and you're not getting fruit, that tells me it's probably a soil issue. And in this case, it's probably a nutrient issue. So go ahead and think in terms of adding a fertilizer, probably one where the middle and the last numbers are a little bit higher. And if you can, do a pH test of your soil to see if it's acidic enough for the blueberries to be growing. It's one of those things that some plants, like blueberries, have very specific needs of soil pH. And I tried growing blueberries for a brief time years and years ago before I knew a fraction of what I knew now. And I thought, oh, I'll grow blueberries. And I put them into my Colorado soil and pretty effectively killed them in the first year because the soil is alkaline here and they need an acidic soil. So when you learn about the plant's needs, you'll typically have more success. And blueberries have very specific soil needs. And if you don't match it, then they're not going to give you the fruit that you're hoping to get. Bud's saying, I have gardened for 40 years without a greenhouse. I have grow shelves set up like you do for seedlings and have had a huge garden each year. Yeah, and I agree with you, Bud. I gardened for almost 34 years, I guess it was, before I got my greenhouse and did fine. Had wonderful gardens, wonderful success. And so it isn't something you have to have. Absolutely. You know, in my case, because I'm making videos and I'm trying to learn as much as I can, one of the big reasons that I wanted to do a greenhouse in my own backyard was to learn more about backyard growing and what I could do. And so that's just me. And that's why I this year in particular glad to have it. But I can't tell you how many years in the past that I had little success in that particular year because the weather just got so crazy here in Colorado with the hailstorms and everything else. So ask yourself that question. Do take the time to figure out if you need it. And if you've been gardening for a long time and you don't need it, that's fine. If you've been gardening for a long time like me and decide that suddenly, well, not suddenly because it did take a while, but eventually you want it, then you can take that step too. I caution especially new gardeners with the first year or second year. You're a new gardener and you think a greenhouse is going to solve any potential problems. Don't get a greenhouse when you're a brand new gardener because it actually can create some problems and make you reach that point that you're overstressed just because of what you've got to do to keep the plants in your greenhouse growing. But once you figure it out, that's why I'm glad that Eli, if Eli is still on, has made those videos, because they make it look really easy growing in Scotland in their greenhouse. But if you take a step and if you listen to what they're saying in their videos and analyzing how they have their greenhouse set up, it's a lot of work. They had a video a few weeks ago that showed their normal spring preparation of the greenhouse. And it takes a lot of work to set up a greenhouse that you're going to be growing in as your primary garden space for the growing season. And so it's not easy at all. But when you do have it done, it can make the whole process easier, because you don't have to worry about the hail destroying your plants. You don't have to worry about birds eating your plants or eating your fruit. You usually don't have to worry about insects eating your plants. And so that's where the advantages of a greenhouse come in. If you have the kind of problems like I do, primarily weather, the solution is to get your plants out of the weather, and the greenhouse might be the answer. I know gardeners that have huge pest problems, deer in particular, and a greenhouse is the only way that they can grow some of their plants, because the deer can't get into the greenhouse. So start looking at the things you can't do in your garden and see if maybe a greenhouse might be an answer for those type of issues. A greenhouse really is magic at keeping the deer from eating your plants, because they can't get into the greenhouse. And I've got the polycarbonate panels that are extremely strong, so I don't have to worry about the hail beating up my plants. It's a consideration. These are all the things to think about when it comes time to making that big decision, because even if you take the inexpensive option, it's going to cost some money, and greenhouses aren't cheap. Even the cheap greenhouses are going to cost some money. So it is something I encourage that you take the time to figure out. Riverdale saying, I'm going to get a Harbor Freight 6x8 greenhouse this fall. Wanted one for years, fairly cheap. A guy down the road has had one for over 5 years, still holding up. Good for you. Harbor Freight does have a good, inexpensive entry-level option for many gardeners. It doesn't work here in Colorado. I know of 3 people here in the Colorado Springs area who got a Harbor Freight greenhouse, and it disintegrated and blew away in one of our thunderstorms that was also had 65 and 75 mile an hour winds associated with it. And so if you choose a greenhouse, you do make sure you match it with your environment. And so in your area, River and Dale on the East Coast, you can probably get by with a greenhouse that's not as big and strong, and it doesn't have to withstand all those winds and all that weather. Whereas for me, in my greenhouse, you can see in the background here, it's a curved shape, and I've got support pieces and support pieces on the support pieces. This is all part of the design of the greenhouse. My greenhouse is engineered to withstand winds more than 60 miles per hour and to withstand feet of snow, because that's the kind of weather I get. So I took the extra time to figure out what kind of greenhouse I needed. This is a Planta greenhouse. I actually have a link to them in the description below. And I stayed away from the Harbor Freight greenhouses because I know people whose greenhouses couldn't withstand the severe weather that we have here in Colorado. So good for you. I'm glad you can save some money and take that option. But everyone should be aware that it's not necessarily the answer if you do have extreme weather conditions. And so it's another one of those things that if you finally take the time and put your greenhouse up and you don't take into account your specific conditions, it can be very upsetting when your greenhouse is collapsed. My daughter has a neighbor that had one of those on the side of their house, and like me, had all the tomatoes and peppers growing inside. They were looking great, and they came out after a late night terrible storm, and not only did they lose the greenhouse, but they lost all of the plants inside as well. And I certainly don't think anybody really wants to have to go through that. In the Garden with Eli and Kate is saying that's a really good point, Gardner Scott. Not all greenhouses are the same. It's worth a bit of time to research. Wind can destroy a lighter greenhouse, so can snow. Yeah, and those are my two biggest issues. And so that's why I've got this big, super sturdy metal greenhouse with polycarbonate panels. And I've been in it, inside my greenhouse. I actually took some footage, and I'll throw it into a video someday when I'm talking about the what we are talking about right now, choosing a greenhouse to match up with your weather. And it was 50-mile-an-hour wind, and I was inside my greenhouse, and this greenhouse is so strong you almost couldn't even tell it was windy outside. There was no creaking, there was no groaning. It just was so solid. That's why I was so glad to get this Planta greenhouse, because it really has held up well to all of that wind. But if you don't have the wind, you don't necessarily need to make that extra expense. And Sunset Gazing has a real good point. For cheap greenhouses, just take extra precautions to brace it in, tether it down, etc. And so it's one of the things I like about this Planta greenhouse. And so you can see the curve. So these curved pieces that are reinforced with extra steel supports, at the bottom, they're actually anchored into the ground. So not only is my greenhouse strong, but at each of the junctions where the polycarbonate panels come together, they're actually buried about 15 inches into the soil. And then at the doorway, where the door frame is, I have those anchored into the soil about 18 inches with concrete at the weakest point, which is that door frame. And so, yeah, my greenhouse is not only a strong greenhouse, but it is buried. The base of it is buried in the ground so that the whole thing just doesn't blow away. I mean, I didn't want that to happen, where my greenhouse stays intact, but the wind is so strong that it blows over and then blows away. So even mine is anchored with legs that are buried into the ground. And then at each of those legs, there's actually a strap, a metal strap on the outside of my greenhouse that goes from one side to the other, that holds those polycarbonate panels in place. And then those straps are anchored to those buried footings. And so those are the kind of things you need to think about, not just how strong it is, but exactly to this point. Tether it, brace it. The Galileo greenhouse, it's so sad. I retired from there 4 years ago now, and occasionally we'll drive by it. The greenhouse is gone. They had to tear it down because of its design. They just had the polycarbonate panels screwed in. It was a dome greenhouse, so the panels were triangles that fit together, and each were screwed to a wood brace. And over time, the greenhouse was up for about 10 years, I think, by the end. The wood was always wet and moist inside the greenhouse, so it was starting to get weak. All the windstorms we have started putting pressure on those polycarbonate panels, and they started blowing off. When I was still working there, the last year, I had 3 of those greenhouse panels blow off in a windstorm, and I had to figure out a way to screw them back into their supports. Over time, a couple years after that, they lost so many panels that the structure was deemed unsafe, and they had to tear the whole thing down. So the design of the greenhouse really does make a difference. And even a greenhouse that is sold, like the dome greenhouses, they can withstand a lot of harsh weather, including the wind. But the actual engineering of the greenhouse might not be enough over time to hold up. And that's why I went with a metal greenhouse with the metal straps and the metal legs that are buried in the ground, because you need to look for that. And so with the cheap greenhouses, with those Harbor Freight greenhouses, you could do the same thing. It's a very lightweight greenhouse. They do have metal frame, but there's no reason why you couldn't take a cargo strap and do the same thing that's designed into my greenhouse. Bury a footing on each side of your greenhouse and run a cargo strap from one side to the other and anchor it, tether it to the ground, and that will help it from blowing away, assuming that you have the same windy kind of conditions that I have here. And I didn't know this in the Garden with Eli and Kate said they lost their first greenhouse to wind. I did not know that. So thank you for sharing that, because that is a bigger problem than I think a lot of people are aware of. And you have to know somebody, or you have to have heard about it to recognize that it's something that you need to deal with. So be aware of that. Dennis E says, my Harbor Freight greenhouse didn't make it one winter. The panels continuously blew out, and finally one of the doors, not good at all with any wind. So thank you for sharing that, because I haven't grown in them. I just know people whose, like yours, greenhouses blew out. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, wind is the nemesis of greenhouses, and you do need to be aware of that before you make the plunge financially, and of course with all of the energy you're going to devote to that. Shandy's Garden says, I bought a whole roll of Velcro and another roll of cargo straps and some more items for when this one gets here. I will not be defeated. Good for you. That's good. Yeah, I'm glad you're going to be able to use the cargo strap idea to hold everything in place, because I just don't want to reach that point where you wait so long to get your greenhouse and then it blows away and you just feel defeated. So take those extra precautions. And you don't have to do like I did with the big 55-gallon drums. Think about why you're doing a greenhouse. We've been talking about this. Think about your conditions, but then think about when you're going to be using your greenhouse. And so my greenhouse sits out in the middle of my garden. It's a long ways away from an electrical outlet. And I'm not going to run an extension cord 75 feet from my garage to my greenhouse just so I can have lights and heat. So I recognize that I am not going to be growing all 4 seasons in my greenhouse. I went into this knowing that that's the situation. And so for me, I start growing in the greenhouse in early spring, and I'll continue growing in the greenhouse until late fall. And I extend my growing season by 3, maybe even 4 months. It just gives me a longer opportunity to grow plants. In the winter, it's still going to get too cold. Even with all this water, even with all that sun, even with the extra insulation I put in, it's still going to get too cold in the greenhouse for the plants to survive in my region. But it might work in your region. And so you might be able to do a good solid 3 months of growing, maybe even 4 months of growing naturally, because you don't have the harsh winters. You just need that extra protection during the winter months. But if you do want to turn it into a productive space in the winter, then you probably need to think about electricity. You need to think about the supplemental heat so that it doesn't get too cold in winter. And you need to think about supplemental light, because winter light is not enough to grow most of the vegetables that we want to grow. And so with heat and with light, now a greenhouse really opens up some opportunities for you to grow during a time of year that maybe you can't be growing right now. That is a big selling point of greenhouses. And you may actually want to reverse the growing season that most of us are doing. I see this, my brother lives down in Arizona, and they just don't do any vegetable growing in the summer because it's just too hot for plants. But they can do growing in the late fall and early spring and most of the winter, but occasionally they'll get some cold days, not cold by Colorado standards, but cold by Arizona standards. And so there are growers in places like Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida, and Texas here in the United States that have a greenhouse so that they can grow in the winter with the supplemental light. They usually don't need the supplemental heat, but that's an opportunity too, where you can be growing in a fully enclosed, protected environment in some of those warmer regions when the rest of us aren't using our greenhouse at all. So that's one of the cool things about greenhouses is depending on how you choose to use it and why you're using it, it really might give you some advantages that you weren't able to find someplace else. And so Eli's saying, my greenhouse is fantastic, but in the colder months, if there isn't a lot of sunshine, it stays very cold. And Scotland is quite cloudy, so in winter it could be very cold in there. Yeah, absolutely. I did that video last year where I measured the temperatures, and a greenhouse is basically just an insulated space. And when it gets cold, it stays cold. And if you live in an area maybe like Scotland that might have a few clouds from time to time, then the clouds will actually not produce the heat from the sun, and it stays cold and continues to get colder over a period of time. And that's where the supplemental heat and light can really make a big difference. And one of the things I think you should definitely take into your account if you're still making the decision one way or the other. Dusty Flat says, my reason for a greenhouse is starting seedlings to keep the mess outside. Yeah, that's a good point. And I started seeing more and more that I actually moved my seedlings out to my greenhouse earlier than I expected. And that was one of the reasons, just because I was potting up and making mess, and I needed more room to put the seedlings. And so I freed up space, and it ended up being a cleaner operation in my house by moving some of that outside. So that's a real good point. You can keep all the soil, all of your containers, everything that you're using outside in the greenhouse, or outside in a shed, and then use it in the greenhouse, and then keep your house nice and clean and tidy. That's definitely an option to consider. And so let's see, Diana 2 is saying, Gardner Scott, I see many greenhouses that have so much wasted space, so much wasted head space. Have you discovered any ways to use this space? Good question. And so I completely agree with you. And that's one reason why I'm not a fan of the dome greenhouses. The Galileo dome was a 42-foot dome greenhouse, 42 feet in diameter. And it wasn't a perfect sphere, but the highest point at the center of that dome was 22 feet high. And talk about wasted space. So this big dome greenhouse, and you can't grow 22 feet high. I was able to use some of that space. And so the head space, and I'm doing this in this greenhouse. I show it in the video that I did with Eli and Kate, where we were doing our tomatoes a couple weeks ago. And so I use the headspace for dropping twine and growing plants like tomatoes up the twine into that headspace. And I did the same thing at Galileo. I actually ran cables from one side of the dome to the other side of the dome, and those cables were 15 feet off the ground. And I had the nylon twine, and I grew cucumbers all the way up to that 15-foot cable. And I grew my tomatoes all the way up to that 15-foot cable. And so there, depending on how tall your greenhouse is, that's an option. Consider some of those vining plants growing up into that space. Now, if you look behind me here, you see this plant in the background. That's a fig tree. I have a fig tree on both ends of my greenhouse. One of the reasons that I'm growing a fig tree is to take advantage of that headspace. I will prune the tree to grow tall and wrap itself on the inside of the greenhouse at about that 8-foot high point. Because I completely agree with you. It is wasted space. And it's only wasted because you don't see a lot of gardeners using it because we haven't figured out how to use it. So run cables and grow vining plants and grow plants like small trees. Or I had fig trees in the Galileo garden for the same reason. I had a kumquat tree in that Galileo greenhouse because I could take advantage of that extra space. And because it's such a big greenhouse side to side, why not grow a tree or two up into that space that is wasted air? And I like to take advantage of space as much as possible. And if you're going to spend the money and take the time to do a greenhouse, fit everything into it that you can. Another opportunity, and you can see this in Eli and Kate's greenhouse, is depending on how tall your greenhouse is, but you can put up shelves and use that as storage for your pots, for your seedling trays, for anything extra that you have. Go ahead, and particularly on the back wall that's not getting the sun shining through it, put up some shelves and use that height that is being wasted as a storage for the containers that you're going to be using through the growing season. And so, yeah, earlier I said I know gardeners who turn their greenhouses into storage sheds. Well, you can go ahead and make that part of your plan, is to put some storage capabilities in your greenhouse to take advantage of that wasted space. So there's a couple ideas. That's what I've done and what I've seen some others do in the greenhouses to try to take advantage of some of that wasted space. Because you're right. And depending on the design, there's going to be more space that's wasted than others, especially if you're opting for a big greenhouse to start with. Stony Gardener says, I have 10-inch tent pegs nailed over the greenhouse frame into the ground, not moved in 3 years. That's a good idea. Yeah. The guidance for my greenhouse showed, and then they have a video on it at the Planta Greenhouse website that shows putting the greenhouse on a wooden foundation. And that's kind of the idea that I think they do, or they suggest for gardeners who are putting a greenhouse, particularly on a wooden foundation, is to hammer in some of those 10-inch or at least 8-inch into the wood. But if you're not putting it on a wood foundation, you probably want at least 10 inches to be nailed into the ground to help anchor it. So thank you for that suggestion, because that's definitely something to think about, that you don't have to have the buried legs with the concrete like I do. A tent peg is actually pretty effective. They're made to keep tents from blowing away, so why not take advantage and put it into your greenhouse as well? Deb C says, Gardener Scott, I need a greenhouse to protect my plants from bunnies and deer. The bunnies severed the stems of my pole beans. Will those plants grow back? Probably not. Depends on where they were eaten. And if the main growing tip is gone on the pole bean, you might get some side shoots, but it's going to take a while, and you're probably not going to get the production you were looking for. My guess is you've still got plenty of time to put more bean seeds in. It's something I've talked about in recent weeks about restarting your garden, and I don't think it's the ideal situation, but rather than trying to recover from plants that have been eaten and may not recover, sometimes it's best to just go ahead and start over again with some new bean seeds, and maybe this time cover them with some hoops and some bird netting or something to try to keep the bunnies away from them. But you're exactly right. That's why I mentioned that earlier. Pest control is a great reason why you should have or why you should consider the possibility of having a greenhouse, because they're gonna eat your plants if you can't protect them. You can take the option of putting barriers around your plants. You can put that netting up. You can do all of those things on a regular basis. And I do those things. All of my fruit trees have the fence around them, and they all have the bird netting over them so that deer don't eat my fruit trees. And I've added metal cages over all of my strawberries because the last 2 years the deer have just eaten all of my strawberry plants. But I could be growing those same kind of plants in a greenhouse and not take any of that effort. It's really a nice way to deal with the pests if the pests keep coming back and it keeps becoming one of those things that is an issue that you just are tired of dealing with. Sonia Moran saying, I often wanted not a greenhouse but a shade house. The problem is storing safely during hurricanes. And you know, I talk about doing the shade cloth in my greenhouse. Assuming you can find a strong enough structure, why not do it as a greenhouse? But then during the hottest times, just cover the walls with a shade cloth and it becomes a shade house. So you might want to consider that. And as long as you can find something like, you know, mine that's engineered for the winds and can be anchored in the ground, that might be an option. And then if you don't want it to be a shade house, you just take the shade cloth off and now it becomes a hothouse, a greenhouse. So lots of options that you can consider. You just really need to come down to your requirements. Even if it doesn't seem like it's that important, if it's something that you're spending a lot of time dealing with, a small greenhouse, a cheap Harbor Freight greenhouse might be able to fix some of those issues. Will It Grow saying, Gardner Scott, when summer comes along, I use my greenhouse to grow my okra in 4-gallon pots. Works great. Nice. And, you know, that's one of the things that you see on Eli and Kate's channels. They do all of their greenhouse growing in pots and grow very successfully in pots. So 4-gallon pots, 5-gallon pots, bigger grow bags, whatever it is you're growing, yeah, absolutely. Use the greenhouse for that option. I opted in my greenhouse because I wanted to grow fig trees and I wanted to grow tomato plants that are 8 feet tall. I opted to have the front side of my greenhouse soil and grow in the ground. And then on the other side, I've got a bench, and if I can ever get these tomato and basil plants in the ground, then I'll use my greenhouse during the summer to grow some smaller plants in pots in my greenhouse. But yeah, definitely an option. Your whole greenhouse can be nothing but potted plants, and they can actually do very well. So I think that's an important consideration. So think about it. It's one of those kind of things that we all have a different answer to that question. Big Wes's Lawn Care, formerly Ghost Dog. It's a much longer name than you had before. I just started doing this stuff and didn't get enough leaves last year, so I shred cardboard, and it's a great mulch. Wet it with fish hydrolysate. It invites fungal or fungi. Windy here too, doesn't blow off. And so it's interesting you say that. I'll be doing a video in the future, but I'm doing a lot more with cardboard this year with that intent as well, because I do have enough leaves, but I'm experimenting with, if you don't have leaves to shred and use as a mulch or to make leaf mold, can you do the same thing with cardboard? So I'm glad to hear that you've started doing that, because I've just started experimenting with some of that as well. And hopefully we'll see how effective it is, and keep our fingers crossed. And I'm guessing that cardboard won't necessarily have as many nutrients as leaves will, but it's much of the same material, and in many cases it's free. And what's better than using free material in the garden? So I'm trying to scroll through. I know I've missed some stuff, so if you have a question, go ahead and make sure you ask it again and put @Gardner Scott in front of it. That helps me see it. Dylan Gray is saying, hey, Scott. Hey, Dylan. Can you get heat and light in your greenhouse with solar? It's relatively inexpensive these days. I'm sure you've already considered it, but just in case. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's what I had at the Galileo greenhouse is we had solar panels. The solar panels ran the ventilation system. They ran all the fans and were very effective at bringing electricity into the greenhouse. And so that's exactly my plan. So a few years back, we had an RV, and I learned all about camping off the beaten path, and my wife liked to find a little spot, and we would camp for 2 or 3 days in the middle of nowhere with no plug-in electricity. And so we had to produce our own electricity. So I got a solar panel. I learned all about charging up batteries and using lights and even low levels of heat that are charged or that are powered by batteries. And then you use the solar panel to charge up those batteries. And that's exactly what I'm planning to do in my greenhouse. And so when the budget allows, hopefully sometime this year, I'll actually make the first steps towards that. But I'm planning on having some solar panels at the very top of my greenhouse where I really don't need the sun coming through. And in the corner of my greenhouse, close to where I put up my water, I'm going to build a battery bay, a series of batteries. And I'll use the solar panel to charge up those batteries. And then I'll use an inverter with the energy from those batteries. And that inverter will charge or will power lights and heat in the greenhouse. So yeah, absolutely. I'm already moving in that direction. I've already drawn up a basic plan of what it's going to look like, where it's going to go, the key in a system like that, and of course you'll see a video about it when I get to that point, is 12-volt batteries are what we have in cars, and people think in terms of using 12-volt batteries, but 6-volt batteries are actually much more efficient as far as the energy that they can hold and the size. It's a pretty small size. So I'm thinking that I may be able to build a system with 4 of the 6-volt batteries. I might go to 6 or 8. I'll have to figure that out once I get into the point of choosing lights and heats and how much energy those will take. But yeah, that's going to be fun. I have considered it. Thank you for that suggestion. Solar power really does open up a lot of opportunities if you figure out how to do it. And so I'm definitely moving in that direction, and I think it would be a good option. And so Two Gals Vermont Homestead with Gales wondering, would you put the shade cloth inside the greenhouse or outside? So what I've done in the past and what I'm planning to do this year is to put the shade cloth inside the greenhouse. And it's just because of the wind. And I could drape the shade cloth on the outside of the greenhouse, but I would really have to anchor it down to keep it from blowing and tearing in the windy conditions. So instead, what I did at the Galileo greenhouse, I actually had a shade cloth that was 15 feet wide and about 25 feet long. No, it was longer than that. It was more than 30 feet long. And so I told you I ran that cable from side to side to support the trellises for the plants growing vertically. I did the same thing. I ran cables on the inside of the greenhouse, and so some of that upper space in that big dome, I had it designed. I got all the way up there with a ladder and put up a pulley system. And so I had basically a 15 by 30 foot sheet of shade cloth and would fit cables. I think I had 4 or 5 cables along the length of it. And I then used the pulley system to pull that shade cloth into place at the top of the greenhouse on the inside. And my greenhouse that I have here outside, this one in behind me, there's enough at the top of the greenhouse that I'll do the same kind of thing. I'll run the shade cloth inside the greenhouse from one end to the other end at the top, and that's going to cut down on most of that sun. Because if you think about the sun in the summer, it's almost directly overhead, and that's where you need the shade cloth, is directly overhead. You don't need a shade cloth down close to the ground or even below the midpoint of that wall, because the sun is just not that low in the sky. And so it's really the top of the greenhouse where you need to put the shade cloth, and we've got enough extra space up there in most of our greenhouses that you should be able to put it into place. And then you don't have to worry about it blowing away, and you don't have to worry about it other than figuring out how you're going to install it in the first place. And so a little engineering, some pulleys, some extra clamps, and hopefully it'll all work out well. Hi, Bud. Bud Jenkins says, Gardener Scout, I've been putting all our shredded paper into the compost, and it works great. We get so much junk. I don't think the ink is a problem, but wonder your thoughts. Yeah, so most of the inks that are being used in the newspaper industry is vegetative ink. A lot of it is soy based. A lot of the junk mail that we get is also using those kind of inks, and so they're perfectly safe for compost. Now, if you look at magazines, particularly the shiny pages of the fashion magazines that have all the different colors, some of those inks are metal based, and there's some discussion, I haven't seen any good studies one way or the other to say whether the metals in those inks are of a high enough volume that it would create a problem, or if the metal itself is even a problem to consider. But that's an issue I've heard some express, that if you use the paper in your compost, you might want to stay away from the shiny printed pictures because that ink is different. But for the rest of it, the newspaper ink, most of the junk mail ink, it's not going to be an issue at all. I know that my newspaper is printed with a soy-based ink. They've actually run articles in the paper from time to time talking about how they are looking at the environment, and they have chosen inks that are safe for the environment. And a lot of printing companies are moving in that direction. So, but I'd say go ahead and keep using your shredded paper. And you're right, it does work great. It's a great option to add that carbon component to your compost. And I don't worry about the ink at all. I use my shredded newspapers in my worm bins, because I'm not worried about the worms eating that ink as well, because it is vegetable based. And so Two Gals was wondering, have you measured the ground temp in the winter on the outside of the greenhouse and inside the greenhouse? Do you think it would be difficult to grow in the ground in the winter? So I didn't measure, well, I guess I technically did measure in the winter. It was very, very early spring. And I didn't have my water set up complete yet, but the temperature of my soil inside the greenhouse was only about 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the ground temperature outside the greenhouse. Now, it was very cold, and I didn't have a repository for that heat during the day, so all the heat would escape at night and the ground would stay cold, but it would heat up faster during the day. And so I think with a passive heating system like I have with the water, I think it will help. I haven't measured it yet. I'll be measuring it over the course of this next winter. Definitely with supplemental heating, if you can keep that heat from escaping at night, then the soil should be warmer too. So that's a good question, and that is a good consideration or good factor to consider if you want to grow 4 seasons in your greenhouse, is the soil temperature in the winter. You do need to have some method in place to try to keep that soil warm. And what I have measured so far shows that it's warmer, but not a lot warmer. Even right now, the cold days, the temperature in the soil temperature in my greenhouse right now with the water is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the soil temperature outside. And so that's about 4.5 degrees Celsius that my soil temperature in the greenhouse is warmer, but it's not a lot warmer. For plants like peppers and tomatoes, that needs to be warmer. And I had to wait until it warmed up enough for me to put my plants in. And they're still not growing outside because that soil temperature outside isn't. And that's one of the advantages of the greenhouse is it's warmer than the outside. It may not be warm enough unless you take some of those extra precautions or extra efforts to bring the temperature up all the way around in the greenhouse. So think about that as a consideration if you are thinking about trying to grow plants in the winter. You're going to need to monitor your soil and make sure it stays warm. Hi, Sherry. Gardner Scott, please make sure your battery banks are well ventilated. They outgas hydrogen and can be explosive if not well ventilated. Thank you. Yes, you're exactly right. And that's an excellent question, or an excellent point. My plan is to actually put in solar powered ventilation first. And so I'm hoping to do that a little bit later in the season to have some solar powered fans and vents to help increase the ventilation. But particularly in the cold months when the air vents aren't going to be open because it's too cold in there, you can have a buildup in some of those gases. And so I'm planning to do it kind of like an RV setup. So in an RV, a recreational vehicle, the battery bank usually has its own ventilation that has air to and from the outside. And so the way I'm envisioning it, the way I've got it designed right now is I'll have a box built into the side of my greenhouse that'll have those batteries. And so the batteries will actually be inside the greenhouse so they don't get excessively cold and freeze, but I'll actually cut ventilation in that wall, the wall of the greenhouse, so that I don't have to rely on that air exchange in the greenhouse, that there is a direct air exchange in that box that I built for the batteries. So yes, you're exactly right. That is a very important consideration because you don't want to have the gases create a problem in the greenhouse, and that the explosion of the battery wouldn't necessarily blow up the greenhouse, but it could cause some serious damage, and I don't want to have to deal with that either. So I'll have to figure out all that design. I'm planning on basically copying the same setup that an RV would have, that you would be sleeping in. My RV, we actually had the bed above where the batteries were. And so the RV manufacturers have to make sure that it's not a hazardous situation. And so I'm planning on copying that setup pretty closely so that I don't have an issue with it. Hey, Bud, thank you for that contribution. Thanks for all the time you spend with us and excellent advice. The chat is also such a great resource. Well, thank you, Bud. I appreciate that. You're very, very welcome. And as I say every week, I get a lot out of this interaction as well. So it's always nice to have you here. Nice to have everybody here. And I appreciate that contribution. Thanks so much. It is a good resource. I've actually gone back to some of my own live streams as I'm doing various things. It's like, what was that thing I said? I need to remind myself, and I'll go back and remind myself some of the things that I talk about, because our memories aren't what they used to be. And so I use it as my own resource. So thanks for pointing that out. Sherry says, an offset stacked roof atop the battery bank enclosure will capture gases. That's a good point. I haven't thought about that, and maybe I can tie that into the hole I'm planning to cut in the side of the greenhouse. It's actually put an offset stacked roof that goes through the wall of the greenhouse. Now you got me thinking. So appreciate that, Sherry. Thank you. That's a good suggestion. So Jay's saying, Tim Collins, my local garden center, finally stopped carrying peat. I get it. I make my own potting mix and have heard mixed results from cocoa coir users? What's the best recourse? And so coco coir is being used by more and more gardeners from all around the world. And you have most of the European companies, or not companies, countries, most of the European countries have flat out outlawed peat. And so their option is to go with the cocoa products or something similar to that. That's the best option at this point. I'm using the coco coir in my hydroponic system, and the plants are doing fine. It works great. You do have to be aware of the source, and look for words like buffered and washed, because there have been problems that some gardeners have had when they use the coco coir and it hasn't been washed. It hasn't had anything added to buffer it. And so the salinity, the salt that can be in it when it comes from some regions is enough to kill the plants. And so the common practice that people that are using it primarily in a hydroponic system is to wash it a couple times to leach out any of that salt or any other hazardous chemicals that might have been involved with the processing of it. And then it is essentially an inert material that you can use in your growing. So there's nothing wrong with it if you consider some of those precautions up front to take away some of those problems that other people have experienced. And so I hope that helps. I like using peat for me, at least with my sources. The peat is a cheaper alternative than the coco coir, and so that's a big reason why I use the peat. But that could change because cost is a big factor, and availability, of course, is a huge factor. If you can't get peat, then you've got to learn to garden without it. And there are millions of gardeners around the world that are no longer using the peat. So I hope that helps, Jade. I know you are very good at finding information and learning from it. So take a look at some of those considerations when you use it, as far as the leaching out of the chemicals that might be in the coir when you first get it, and then things should work well from that point on. So think about it. Willie Weed says you can get batteries with vent hoses built in them. Interesting. I haven't seen those. I've gone to my local battery store and was checking out the 6-volt batteries. I'll have to ask them about the vent hoses built into it. So thank you for that suggestion. I wasn't even aware that was an option. So definitely something that will make it easier if I can figure it out. So, okay, let's see. Where's that comment? I just scrolled past it and want to go back. Oh, there it is. Gardens Happen. I recently heard that BPI-approved plant-based plastic bags can be composted in small amounts. Yeah, I've seen that there are some studies that are starting to take place. There are some small-scale studies. The same with the some of the fast food outlets, at least here in Colorado, are starting to use compostable forks and spoons, and some of the materials for takeout food are being made with compostable ingredients. And so the plastic bags that are also compostable is one of those things that you can put into your compost pile. Now, be aware, the stuff that I've read on it so far is it will break down, but it can take a long time to break down. So maybe cutting it into small pieces and then mixing it with the compost, and then when you go to use your compost, you might still see some of those little pieces left behind. They'll still break down even in the soil if you use the compost in the soil, but you might want to sift out some of the bigger pieces and put them back into the compost. So that is true from what I've read, and it is an option for people that are composting that are also getting the fast food or are aware that the plastic bags they're using are compostable. don't toss them. The whole reason that industries are starting to make materials that can be broken down is to help out the environment. So help out the environment in your own garden and reuse some of those materials, and hopefully it'll work out. So yeah, and there's Heidi right on top of things. Compostable plastic will still take a long time to break down. So that would be my biggest concern, and thank you, Heidi, for substantiating that, because it is something that and Shima from Mississippi, I'm guessing, says that the compostable plastics are practically compostable at high temperatures in industrial settings. And that was one of the things I saw, one of the studies that said if in hot composting, where we're getting the temperature up into that 160 degree Fahrenheit range, the 71 Celsius range, then it does break down much faster. But if you are just burying it into your garden bed, it's probably not going to break down anytime soon. It'll be there for years to come. So yes, the assumption is that if you're composting it, you're composting using a hot composting method. And the industrial settings, those are the same temperatures that they're getting in the industrial settings. So I know some of you are composting in your pile and getting those high temperatures. So it's a consideration that you can use those products in your compost, have a hot pile, but I would still sift out any of the chunks that are remaining afterwards, just to not have to deal with it too much. You know, I'm not a big fan of digging in my ground and digging up a big chunk of something like a piece of plastic that didn't break down in my compost pile. So that's what I would do, is strain it, sift it out beforehand, and then everything would be great. Hobbit House says, I didn't even get my Harbor Freight greenhouse up before the wind blew it over and bent it trash. So there you go. There's another example from experience, and the Harbor Freight is an option if it fits your environment. But I think the message of the day is that wind is the worst problem that we have, those of us that are growing in a greenhouse. And so make that consideration to match your greenhouse to the wind. And so again, that's why I really like my Planta greenhouse, because it's sturdy. And in their literature and on their website, I'm pretty sure they say 60 mile per hour is what it's been tested for and what it's engineered for. But last year, I know we had 75 mile an hour gusts in my area, and there was zero damage to my greenhouse. So a couple years ago, we had 90 mile an hour gusts. Haven't seen that yet. I'll definitely take a closer look, but I'm certain that my greenhouse that's engineered for 60 miles per hour can withstand a gust of 90 miles per hour without too much difficulty. So we'll see. I'll keep reporting my experiences with my greenhouse as I continue. Now, one thing I did want to point out, as I move to the side, you can see, and I'd see it in a couple videos, the middle point of my greenhouse, I've got concrete pavers down. And so if you're growing in a greenhouse, I like a clean greenhouse. I like a greenhouse that's not all muddy and that you're going to get muddy in walking in it. So consider putting some kind of path down the middle of your greenhouse. And the path really should be stone. It can be gravel, it can be concrete pavers, but that stone is a passive heating opportunity. It will warm up during the day and it will release that heat at night. So even though it looks nice in my greenhouse to have those pavers in place, and definitely like something that looks good in the garden, the reason I chose that material was because of the heat that it can provide. It's not as effective as water. Water is the most effective passive heating source in a greenhouse. But the gravel and the concrete pavers are another great option, since you probably should have a path anyway. Go ahead and make that path out of a material that can benefit the greenhouse. So that's one of those design components that I think we like to we like the look of it, but if you can make the look actually fit with what your greenhouse needs, it kills two birds. Celsith, I'd love a greenhouse, mostly to sit in during rainstorms and enjoy the energy. Planting in it would be a bonus. LOL. Yeah, I designed my greenhouse. I've got this long bench that I put plants on, but in the back of my greenhouse, it's a sitting spot. I'm actually planning on putting a chair or a stool permanently in my greenhouse. I haven't done it yet, but that is in my plan, because I agree with you. Sitting in the greenhouse on those days when you just need that energy, you just need that plant energy surrounding you. And even when it's overcast outside and the garden may be a little drizzly and cold, you could get in your greenhouse. I really enjoyed that over the course of the last 6 weeks, where I'd go outside and it was just so cold and overcast, but I'd go in my greenhouse and it was magical. It really was. It's so nice to just be around plants that are growing in a warm environment. So yeah, sitting in a greenhouse is a good reason to have a greenhouse. And now I can speak from experience. That is one of those things that I like to have. David says, my little greenhouse only has a 4x6 footprint, but works for me. Good for you. Crushed stone as a floor. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. Because yeah, absolutely. It's not about the size. It's about what you want to do with it. And 4x6 may seem small to others, but if it's working for you, that's a total bonus. And I'm glad to hear you got the crushed stone as a floor. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, absolutely. That is one of those things that use it and take all of these considerations into play to use it. It's like I was thinking about my granddaughters, and they came to visit about the time we were really starting to be cold. And we like to walk through the garden. I like to take them through the garden. And it was too cold for us to do much outside other than just walk through and see it and come back. But the greenhouse now opens up opportunity. So they're actually going to be here next week. And I'm expecting that my black cherry tomato plant that I have inside the greenhouse, the fruit on it should be just about ready in a week. And so that's one of the favorite things we have when my grandkids come to visit, is walk through the garden and pick something to eat every time we see something that could be eaten. And it's just been too cold on the outside of my garden to reach that point yet. But I can take them into my garden or into my greenhouse, and we can now do the same thing that we like to do in the greenhouse. And so, again, what are you going to use it for? I use it for soaking up plant energy so I feel better. I use it for growing plants when I can't be growing plants outside. And I just like the atmosphere and the other benefits I'm starting to learn from it. So I really am glad I have this greenhouse. It just really hit me in the last couple weeks when my whole season has been turned upside down, that I can still be a gardener and still do the things that I want to do. And so as you ask yourself the question about why do you want to have a greenhouse, it ties into this other question that I think we all need to ask ourselves, because I've been getting this question a lot, and I've been asking myself this question because the weather has been so crazy. When is it too late to garden, to start your garden, to put your plants in? When is it too late to start your growing season? We have our definition of the growing season. The definition of the growing season is the length of time, the number of days from your last frost in spring to your first frost in fall. And so you can look at the calendar and you can figure out the length of your growing season. But what happens if the last frost in spring is not a match with the calendar date? And what happens if cold weather moves in and throws everything off? I've been measuring my soil temperature daily. I actually have my thermometer in a bed right now full time because I need to get my plants in the ground. And these cold days that we've been having here in Colorado with all this rain, my soil temperature right now, just a couple days away from the start of summer, my soil temperature is colder than it was on the first day of spring. It was warmer 3 months ago than it is right now. That's how cold it's been. And so I would normally be putting plants in. I would normally see the seeds that I have actually put in the ground germinate. They're not germinating because the soil is just too cold. I measured my soil this morning and it is 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 12 degrees Celsius. This is the beginning of summer and my soil temperature is colder than it's been in 3 months. And so at what point do you hang it up? At what point do you say, I don't have enough time to grow this year? And I'm almost at that point outside. I just don't have enough time for my peppers to mature, for my tomatoes to mature, for me to get to the point that I can harvest what I normally harvest during the summer. And so as I ask myself this question, and I know others in my area that are asking themselves the same question, at what point do you just say, I'm not having a garden this year? And you just choose to tidy up your beds, do other projects, do whatever it is you want to do to get outside. At what point do you make that determination? And it's a personal decision. I think it really comes down to why we choose to garden. And you have to ask yourself that question as well. I garden because I like getting outside. I like getting my fingers dirty. I like building the beds. I like learning new things. And I like the harvest. Well, if you take away one of those components, does it diminish the other reasons that you garden? And so I want to throw out at you, if you're having a particularly tough gardening year, that it doesn't need to diminish what you get from your garden. You can still get some plants growing. You can still do your projects. You can still get outside. You can still do everything you do in the garden. You can get that exercise. You can get the healthy benefits of gardening without a harvest happening. Now, it may seem like wasted effort, and that's why it's easy to walk away from gardening and say that you aren't going to do it because it's just too hard this year. That's okay. But if the reason is not the harvest, go ahead and get out there and do some gardening. So I'm going to be putting in a lot of the plants that I always put in. Pretty sure that I'm not going to get a harvest. Or if I do, it's probably not going to be a good harvest. But that's not why I garden. That's one of the reasons I like gardening, but that's not why I garden. And then on those days when it does get a little distressing, I'll walk in my greenhouse where things are growing and things are looking good, and I'll sit on my stool and I'll soak in all of that positive plant energy from inside the greenhouse. And that's what really got me thinking about doing this live stream today. I like the plants. I like being around the plants. I like having the sun shine on me. And at least for me in the last month, the greenhouse is the only place I could go to get that. Now, hopefully that's changing. It's supposed to be a nice day today. It's supposed to be a nice day tomorrow. We'll see if that soil temperature gets up to the point that I can get rid of some of these plants in my greenhouse and put them out in the garden. But that's really not the point. The point is just getting out and doing it. So what kind of gardener are you? And are you asking yourself those kind of questions when things get tough? And I think the answer to the question varies based on when you ask it. 3 years ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, we had a crazy early freeze, like middle of September. We normally don't get freezes till the end of September, often the beginning of October. And I think it was like September 8th or September 9th. It was a freeze, and not just a freeze, it was a hard freeze. It actually got down to, I think it was 26 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about -3 Celsius. That was enough to pretty much kill everything in the garden before the full harvest was done. And I asked myself that question at that point, with all the dead plants around me: is the season over? Or is there more that I can do? And the answer to my question to myself at that point was, yeah, the season's over. There isn't enough time for me to put more seeds in, to put more plants in, to try to revive the plants that did survive. And so my season ended up being about a month shorter that year than usual. And I was okay with it. It actually just gave me more time to clean up the garden and prepare the soil and get everything ready for winter. So don't think that there's the same answer all the time when you have to ask yourself these tough questions about why we garden and whether we're going to keep gardening and whether the season is good enough to continue. It's okay to say yes, it's okay to say no, as it fits with your specific garden. So I just wanted to share that with you today because I'm going through it. I am having to decide if I'm going to plant out all of my beds. And I'm going to put plants in the ground, but I'm not sure that I'm going to put all of my plants in the ground. I may shorten the plan for this year with what I had intended on growing. I want to get my cucumbers growing. I want to get my squash growing, but I put some zucchini seeds in the ground 2 weeks ago. They didn't germinate. This time of year, normally going into summer, it takes 3 days for zucchini seeds to germinate. They've just rotted in the ground because it's so cold and wet. So today, now that we've got sun out, now the soil's starting to dry a bit, I'm going to put more zucchini seeds in the ground almost a full month later than usual. I'm going to do it because I like doing it, and that's what it's all about. But I'm not going to be doing some of the other squashes that I had planned to do, because like the delicata squash that I wanted to do this year, I don't think I'm going to do the delicata squash because it's just too late. By the time I get the seeds in the ground, by the time they germinate, by the time the plants start growing, it's going to be July, and those plants are going to take long enough to give me the fruit I want that I'm not sure that it's worth the effort to me in my garden this year. I don't want to be disappointed by a plant that I've been looking forward to. I don't want it to struggle in cold soil conditions. So I'll go with something else. I think I'm going to do some more of my cool season plants. My spinach is doing great. My lettuce is doing great. My cabbage is doing great. And I may go ahead and plant some more of those this week in that cool soil because they will germinate. And then I can cover them with shade cloth as the days start getting warmer. And I may actually get an extra harvest of those cool season crops that I wouldn't be able to get in previous years. So trying to find the silver lining in these literal clouds that we're having. And that's kind of the direction I'm going. So I'm modifying my plan this year. And if I choose to do that, I'll definitely let you know how it turns out. But these are the kind of things we need to think about as gardeners, is modifying our plan if the weather just isn't cooperating, and therefore we have to move in a different direction. If the reason we're gardening is just to get out there and garden, then it really doesn't matter what the plan looks like as long as we're getting out there and gardening. So Shandy's Garden is saying, I think I'm going to go ahead and just focus on the fall garden. I've never really focused on the cold crops like I should. I'm turning my waiting room into a classroom like always. There you go. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Foregoing the summer garden as it was planned. And yeah, maybe now putting more focus on those cool season plants, that fall garden, and how you're going to put that into place. And a lot of those plants, like Brussels sprouts and broccoli, they'll benefit from starting indoors ahead of time. So think about starting some of those plants indoors now to put out into your garden in July or early August for a fall garden. And we often miss the opportunity for some of those fall garden plants because we're so busy during the hot months that we don't think about starting those cool season plants indoors. Well, if you're not doing a summer garden, maybe think about doing some of that prep indoors as you get ready for it. Stony Gardener saying, I'm pretty confident my pumpkins that are now just sprouting will mature, but hey, it's less brown space and more compost scraps. I'm really struggling with my pumpkins, whether I'm going to grow them or not, because I love growing pumpkins, and my granddaughters come and they pick out their pumpkin at Halloween, and I just don't think I'm going to have enough time this year for a harvest of pumpkins. But I agree with you. That's what I like to do too. My pumpkin patch is a big source of compost material. And so it's green. You're exactly right. And it covers up that brown space. So maybe I'll go ahead and put the pumpkin seeds in when the soil warms up a little bit more. So thank you. That gives me an extra little motivation that I might just need. Bud saying, I grew up in a farming environment, and like farmers, gardeners need to adapt and adjust to deal with the weather. This year is very late for me too. So thank you for sharing that, Bud. It's one of those things that what makes us crazy as gardeners, by using the definition of crazy where we do the same thing over again expecting different results, is that we keep doing it expecting different results. We keep expecting each season to be the best season ever. And sometimes it may end up being the worst season ever. But you keep coming back, you keep doing more, and I'm already ready to chalk this season up as one for the history books, one for the garden journal. Normally here in my part of Colorado, we get just over an inch of rain over the course of the entire month of June. I've already had more than 8 inches of rain in my garden. The normal temperature that we should be having at this time of year is 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius. Yesterday was the first day that we actually got close to that temperature. Not to it, not above it, but close to it. And so this is literally a year for the history books, meteorologically speaking. And it's not matching what gardeners want to do, but hey, we roll with it, we modify, we make it happen, and we get out there and keep doing it. So that's what I'm going to do, is get out there and keep gardening, keep doing it. I'm going to learn a lot this year, believe me, and I'll share as much of that as I can with you. And you can expect that I'll do some of that sharing next Monday. I'll be back then. I hope you're back too. Hope to see you then, and we'll have another gardening topic and answer your questions. And between now and then, I hope you have a great gardening week. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.